"My dad will whip me if I don't bring food," the boy whispered, clutching his empty stomach as the sun scorched the lonely desert. He never expected help to come from a stranger, but one solitary Apache man would change everything with a single, quiet act of kindness. Asterisk before starting the story. Don't forget to like the video and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Asterisk. The boy's small hands trembled as he gripped the worn strap of his satchel, the fabric fraying at the edges from constant use. His stomach twisted painfully, a hollow ache that had been gnawing at him for hours, maybe even a whole day. He had skipped breakfast, too afraid to wake his father, and now the morning's emptiness had grown into a gnawing, relentless hunger that made his head spin. The thought that plagued him most wasn't just the pain in his belly, it was the fear. "My dad will whip me if I don't bring food," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. The words hung in the dry morning air, as fragile as he felt. His father's anger was swift and unforgiving, a storm the boy had learned to avoid at all costs. Just last week, he had returned home empty-handed after a failed attempt to trade a few sticks for dried corn, and the memory of the red-hot sting of his father's belt still burned on his back. That punishment wasn't just physical. It was a reminder that failure had no place in their harsh, unforgiving world. He glanced toward the small cabin he called home. Its rough wooden walls seemed to lean toward him, as though they, too, expected him to deliver something tangible: food, water, proof that he was capable of surviving on his own. The boy's eyes filled with a mix of determination and fear. He knew he had to leave, had to find something to eat before his father returned, but the thought of venturing out alone into the wilderness made his chest tighten. The forest and desert beyond their tiny homestead were vast and unpredictable, full of creatures he didn't understand and paths that twisted like riddles he couldn't solve. Yet, hunger is a powerful force. It propelled him forward even as his legs ached, his small feet scraping against the coarse earth. He carried nothing but a satchel with a few scraps of cloth, a rusty tin cup, and a stubborn hope that he might find something to fill the emptiness inside. Every sound, birds chirping in the trees, the distant murmur of a stream felt amplified in the quiet morning. His ears strained for danger, his heart beat erratically, and yet he pressed on. The fear of his father's wrath outweighed the fear of the unknown. As he walked, he thought about what he might find. Perhaps a squirrel would be daring enough to snatch from, or maybe a patch of wild berries hidden among the brambles. The boy's imagination filled the emptiness of his stomach with fleeting images of cornmeal and dried meat, the smells almost tangible. He imagined the look of satisfaction on his father's face, the way the whipping might be replaced with a rare nod of approval, if only he could bring something back. But the boy also felt an isolating despair. He was alone. No sibling to help, no neighbor to lend a hand. The world outside his home was a vast and different expanse, and he felt the full weight of its silence pressing against him. Each step seemed heavier than the last, his small frame weighed down by a fear that was far larger than his body. Hunger and fear had a way of amplifying each other, twisting into a single, gnawing knot that seemed impossible to untangle. Still, he walked on, whispering to himself a small mantra, barely audible above the rustling leaves. "I have to. I must. I can." Each word was a thread keeping him tethered to hope, even as despair threatened to pull him under. The boy's desperation was raw, palpable, and yet, in that quiet, tense morning, it was also the beginning of something else, a journey that would carry him far beyond hunger, far beyond fear, and into the unlikeliest of encounters. The boy left the fragile safety of the homestead behind, stepping into the wilderness that stretched endlessly before him. The sun had climbed higher now, casting sharp, golden light over the dusty trails and scrubby brush. Each step he took was met with resistance. The ground was uneven, scattered with jagged rocks that tore at his thin shoes, and thorny bush scratched at his arms as if warning him to turn back. Yet hunger drove him forward, a relentless drumbeat in his chest that overpowered the ache in his legs and the sting of the sun on his neck. He had no clear destination, only the instinctive hope that somewhere ahead the earth might offer him sustenance. Every rustle in the trees, every distant call of a crow made him pause, tense with fear. The wilderness was alive, but not in a comforting way. It was indifferent. Predators and dangers lurked just beyond his sight, and yet the boy could not stop. The fear of returning empty-handed and the memory of his father's harsh punishments propelled him into the unknown. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time had no meaning in the unbroken monotony of sand, stone, and thorn. His stomach groaned loudly, a constant reminder of his urgency. He tried to ignore it at first, clenching his teeth and picking up his pace, but eventually the hunger became a physical weight that slowed his steps. His throat was dry, his lips cracked, and sweat stung his eyes. At some point, he sank onto a flat rock, letting the sun bake his back as he pressed his palms to his face. The emptiness inside him felt like a living thing, stretching and twisting with every pang of need. Despite the pain, he scanned the horizon for signs of life or food. Perhaps a berry bush tucked among the rocks, or a rabbit timidly nibbling grass, anything that could be taken without danger. He remembered the old lessons whispered by neighbors long ago: which plants were safe, which streams were drinkable, which animals could be caught. But the wilderness was vast, and knowledge alone offered no guarantee. Anxiety crept in. The boy's small mind raced with dark thoughts. What if he failed again? What if the punishment waiting at home was even worse this time? Even as he trudged on, the boy's senses sharpened. He noticed the subtle changes in the air, the slight shadow of a cloud overhead, the faint sound of water trickling far off, the dry, dusty scent that indicated he was approaching a canyon. Every detail became significant, every movement of leaves or shift in light a potential clue for survival. Hunger had made him desperate, but it had also heightened his awareness, making him more attuned to the environment than he had ever been. As the afternoon wore on, fatigue began to set in. His small legs trembled under his weight, and he had to pause frequently, leaning against gnarled tree trunks or the rough bark of a mesquite. Yet in these moments, he forced himself to focus on hope rather than despair. He whispered tiny encouragements. Keep going. You'll find something. Just a little farther. It was during one of these pauses, perched on a jagged rock and scanning the canyon below, that he first saw the figure of the man. The boy froze, unsure whether to flee or approach. The man was alone, quietly tending a small fire, the smoke curling lazily into the clear blue sky. There was something in the man's presence, calm, steady, and unthreatening, that drew the boy closer, despite the lingering fear that the wilderness might be hiding danger at every turn. For the first time that day, the boy felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps he was not entirely alone, and perhaps, just perhaps, the wilderness could offer something other than hunger and fear. The boy crept down the narrow canyon path, every nerve alert, his small hands clutching the satchel tightly against his chest. The figure ahead moved with quiet purpose, tending a small fire that crackled softly, sending thin spirals of smoke into the warm afternoon air. The boy paused behind a low boulder, peering around its edge, unsure whether this man was a friend or another danger lurking in the wilderness. The Apache man was tall and lean, with weathered skin that spoke of decades spent under the sun, and eyes that carried a calm depth like the still waters of a hidden spring. He worked methodically, breaking pieces of dried meat and arranging small stones around the fire. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, and strangely comforting in their steadiness. The boy couldn't help but notice the way the man's presence seemed to harmonize with the desert itself, part of the land, yet apart from it, at peace in a world that had been so harsh to the boy. Fear wrestled with curiosity inside the boy. He wanted to call out, to ask for help, but his voice caught in his throat. He remembered his father's warnings. Never trust strangers. Yet hunger clawed at him mercilessly, and the gentle manner of the man, so different from the harshness he knew, was a quiet invitation. The boy took a hesitant step forward, then another, his bare feet brushing over dry leaves and stones. The Apache man noticed the movement and paused, tilting his head slightly. His eyes met the boy's, and there was no judgment there, no accusation for venturing alone. Instead, there was recognition and understanding of the boy's fear, his hunger, and his courage. The man's gaze was steady, patient, allowing the boy to approach at his own pace. The boy finally stopped a few feet from the fire, his chest heaving from the climb and from the tension of the moment. He swallowed hard, feeling the dry scratch of his throat, and murmured, almost inaudibly, I haven't eaten all day." The words felt small, inadequate, yet they carried the weight of his desperation. The Apache man nodded, as if he had expected this, and without speaking, he offered a small portion of the meat and a few crumbs of bread from his fire. The boy froze, unsure whether to accept. He had never experienced such unprompted generosity, especially from someone he did not know. Hunger battled pride and fear in his chest. Finally, with a shaky hand, he reached out and took the food. The warmth of it against his fingers was a strange comfort, a tangible reminder that kindness could exist even in the most unforgiving places. Sitting cross-legged on the ground, the boy began to eat slowly, savoring each morsel as though it were a treasure. The Apache man continued his quiet work, tending the fire, but never intruded, allowing the boy the dignity of eating in peace. In that silence, a subtle bond formed, a wordless connection between two beings who, in different ways, knew loneliness and survival. For the first time that day, the boy felt the sharp edges of fear and hunger soften. He realized that not all strangers were threats, that even in the vast, indifferent wilderness, there could be moments of safety, of understanding, of care. And in that simple, shared meal, he found a flicker of hope, a fragile, glowing ember that suggested the world was not entirely cruel. The boy looked down at the small portion the Apache man had given him. It was hardly more than a few pieces of dried meat and a thin slice of bread. Yet to the boy, it was more than enough to feel like a feast. He stared at it for a moment, almost afraid to touch it, as if the simple act of taking the food might somehow be wrong. Hunger had taught him desperation, but the man's quiet presence taught him something else, patience and trust. The Apache man watched the boy carefully, his expression calm, almost gentle. He did not speak, did not rush him, and did not demand anything in return. It was a gesture so simple, yet so profound, that the boy felt a lump rise in his throat. In that moment, the desert around them, the sharp rocks, the endless sand, the scorching sun faded from his mind. All that mattered was the man sitting across from him, offering what little he had with no expectation, no judgment, only care. The boy hesitated, then slowly took a piece of meat. The flavor was rich, smoky from the fire, and it filled him with warmth he hadn't felt in days. His stomach ached from hunger, but more than that, his heart ached from relief. Relief that someone could be kind, relief that he could eat without fear of punishment, relief that he wasn't completely alone. With each bite, he felt a fragile sense of security, a rare luxury for someone who had been so frightened and hungry. The Apache man leaned back slightly, allowing the boy to eat in peace. He stirred the embers of the fire with a stick, and the flames flickered warmly against his weathered face. Though his actions were simple, they spoke volumes. He had very little, perhaps barely enough for himself, yet he had chosen to share it. The boy's mind struggled to comprehend it. He had always known the world as harsh and unforgiving, where kindness was rare and often transactional. This, however, was different. This was generosity for its own sake, a humble offering without strings or demands. As the boy chewed slowly, savoring each bite, he looked up at the Apache man. The silence between them was comfortable, almost sacred. It was a quiet exchange, wordless but meaningful, a bridge forming between two lives that had rarely known compassion. The boy's eyes brimmed with tears, not of sadness, but of gratitude and awe. He had come into the wilderness terrified and starving, expecting only danger or indifference, and yet here was a stranger, offering him nourishment as if he were family. Finally, the boy spoke, his voice trembling. "Thank you," he said, barely above a whisper. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he could manage. The Apache man nodded, a faint, knowing smile on his lips. No words were necessary to convey understanding. The boy could feel it in the man's calm presence, in the careful way he had tended the fire, in the unspoken assurance that he was safe here for now. In that moment, the boy realized that food was not just sustenance for the body, it was also a lifeline for the spirit. This simple meal, humble as it was, carried with it something far greater than hunger could demand. It carried kindness, empathy, and a quiet reminder that even in the harshest of worlds, generosity could exist. And in the heart of the boy, a tiny seed of trust and hope began to grow, nurtured by the man's selfless act and the warmth of the shared meal. The boy sat cross-legged beside the small fire, the warmth from the flames seeping into his chilled limbs. Each bite he had taken had filled not only his stomach but also a part of him that had long been empty, a part that had known fear, neglect, and isolation. As he chewed slowly, savoring each morsel, he realized something he had never felt before, a quiet sense of safety. The Apache man's calm presence made the wilderness around them feel less threatening, less vast and indifferent. For the first time that day, the boy allowed himself to breathe without the constant tension of fear pressing on his chest. After finishing the meal, he set the empty pieces of bread aside and looked up at the man. Their eyes met, and in that gaze, words were unnecessary. The boy felt a wave of gratitude that seemed too large to be captured by simple thank yous. He wanted to speak, to express the enormity of what the man's kindness meant, but the words felt inadequate. Instead, he smiled shyly, the corners of his mouth trembling with emotion. The Apache man responded with a gentle nod, a silent acknowledgement of the boy's feelings. There was no need for conversation. The act of sharing, the act of being there for someone who had no one, had already spoken volumes. In that quiet exchange, the boy understood something profound. Connection did not always require words. Sometimes it was the simple act of being present, of giving without expecting, that created the deepest bonds. As the minutes stretched on, the boy began to feel lighter, as if a weight he had carried for years had been lifted, even if only slightly. The fear of punishment and the gnawing hunger that had driven him across the wilderness now seemed distant. In their place grew a fragile but undeniable sense of trust. He realized that, despite the harshness of the world he knew, there were still pockets of kindness, people who could offer compassion without judgment. Tentatively, the boy spoke again, his voice steadier this time. I didn't know someone could just give like that, without asking for anything." The Apache man simply smiled, the lines of his face softening in the flickering firelight. His eyes held a quiet wisdom, one that spoke of years spent observing the world, understanding its hardships, yet choosing to respond with generosity when he could. The boy's heart swelled with something he had long forgotten: hope. Hope that not all strangers were threats, that not every adult would respond to failure with anger, that there were still people who believed in simple human kindness. For the first time, he felt that he could face the world beyond his fear, even if only a little. They remained there for a while longer, the boy watching the flames dance and the man tending the embers. There was a rhythm to their silence, a subtle harmony that comforted him. In the stillness, he felt a bond forming, a quiet connection that transcended words, a recognition that sometimes the simplest gestures could leave the deepest mark. By the time the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the canyon, the boy felt something he had never felt before, a sense of belonging, however fleeting, in a world that had often felt cold and unyielding. And as he prepared to leave, he carried with him not just the memory of a meal shared, but the warmth of human connection, a spark of trust, and the first glimmer of hope he had known in a long time. The boy rose from the canyon floor, brushing dust and small pebbles from his clothes. His stomach was full, a rare and comforting sensation, but more importantly, his heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. He turned to look at the Apache man one last time. The man sat quietly by the fire, his expression calm and unassuming, as if the small act of sharing a meal had been nothing at all. Yet for the boy it had been everything. "Thank you," he whispered again, louder this time, the words carrying all the weight of his gratitude. The man simply nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his weathered face. There was no need for speeches, no grand gestures. Kindness, he seemed to say, needed no explanation. The boy understood this deeply, feeling it resonate in his chest. As he began the walk back toward home, the boy reflected on the journey he had taken that day. The wilderness had seemed endless and dangerous, but it had also brought him to this moment, to an encounter that would change how he saw the world. He had left terrified and alone, expecting only hunger and hardship. Instead, he had found generosity, patience, and a quiet, human connection that offered him something far greater than mere food. Hope. Each step toward home was lighter than the last. He no longer felt entirely at the mercy of fear. He knew that he would still face his father's anger, that punishment might still come, but now he carried with him a memory stronger than dread. He had experienced goodness, and it had left an imprint on him, a reminder that even in the harshest circumstances, compassion existed. By the time he reached the outskirts of his home, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the familiar landscape. The cabin looked the same as it had that morning, rough and unyielding, yet he felt a small, quiet change within himself. He was still the same boy, but now he carried the knowledge that even the smallest gestures of kindness could matter immensely. He stepped inside, clutching the satchel a little less tightly, the weight within it lighter not because it held more food, but because he was carrying something far more important: courage, understanding, and the memory of a stranger who had offered his only meal without question. Even if the world outside remained unforgiving, he had learned that kindness could ripple outward, starting in the smallest, most unexpected ways. That night, as he lay in his bed, he thought of the Apache man and the warmth of the fire, of the taste of food that had filled more than his stomach, of the quiet connection that had reminded him of hope. He understood now that lessons often came in moments of generosity, not punishment, and that courage sometimes meant accepting help when it was offered. And somewhere deep in his heart, the boy made a silent promise to carry that lesson forward, to remember that even in fear, even in hunger, there could be light, and that small acts of kindness had the power to change lives forever.